on the US presidential elections, any lessons for Ukraine. Before we begin, this webinar will be offered in both English and Ukrainian. To access the Ukrainian translation, please switch to Spanish on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. This is because they don't always have a Ukrainian translation in some of the older versions of Zoom. If you would like to view this webinar in English, please change to the English channel. And after you select your channel, please also click Mute Original Audio.
Шановні учасники, ласкаво просимо на наш вебінар.
Dear participants, welcome to our webinar dedicated to US presidential elections. Any lessons for Ukraine? Before we begin, we shall inform you that this webinar is provided in both Ukrainian and English language. If you want to listen our webinar in Ukrainian, please select Spanish language. This is due to the specificity of Zoom. If you want to listen to this webinar in English, please select English audio.
Well, thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope that everyone has found the correct channel. This webinar event is particularly for our Ukrainian friends and partners as part of IFES's US election program. IFES is a 501c3 organization funded in part by the US government with a bipartisan board of directors and a nonpartisan organizational identity. We provide apolitical democracy and elections assistance. My name is Meredith Applegate, and I am the program advisor for IFES in Ukraine. My co-moderator today is IFES's legal advisor, Elisa, who you just heard from. Over this webinar, we will be joined by some incredible speakers, both from the US and experts from Ukraine. As the webinar progresses, I encourage all of you to type any questions or comments you might have into the chat or the Q&A box as we go along. We will try to bring questions to the attention of our panelists as we progress through the webinar. To begin our webinar, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz, our Regional Director of Europe and Eurasia. Beata, welcome, and if you'd like to give opening remarks, that would be great.
who act as intermediaries for the popular vote. And at the time of its inception in the 1700s, there was a feeling that both administratively, but also methodologically, this was a better way of translating individual votes into an overall in a way that would be more representative. And so the electors that are assigned to individual states vary by the population size. And they range, for instance, from 55 electoral votes for California, which is a very big and highly populated state, down to only 3 electors for places like Montana, which have very sparse populations. And you probably know that from the 538, a majority of 270 are necessary to win the presidency. But the way in which colleges allocate their votes vary from state to state. And so in some cases, certain states give all of their electoral college votes to the popular vote winner. Some states split their votes between Republicans and Democrats in various ways. And this makes the results notoriously difficult to understand and to predict, both for those abroad, but also for people who live in the country themselves. And that's why you see so much of the discussion being about these electoral college votes. And historically, 5 of the presidential elections in the United States have actually resulted in the candidate that won the most popular vote actually losing the presidency. And this has happened twice in the last 20 years, most recently in 2016, but also in 2000 in that famous election. Then there's the legal framework. The federal government has no role in carrying out elections at the presidential level, and the Constitution relegates this to the states. The Election Assistance Commission, which exists in the United States and is analogous to some degree to the Central Election Commission in Ukraine, only has an advisory role here, so it has no legal power. And there are differing provisions by state to state and sometimes by county to county. So there's really a patchwork of legal frameworks and provisions. And this really impacts the principles of legal predictability. And just one example is that the courts have just decided the timelines for counting postal votes, for instance, at the very last hour. And for instance, in Pennsylvania, they've decided that they can continue to count for 3 days after Election Day, 12 days in the case of North Carolina. But this also gives rise to concern about possible violence for those that don't understand or who don't agree with these rulings at the last minute. And this is even more complicated by the presence of partisan observers in polling stations and the allowance in certain states to open carry guns and weapons, which is legally permitted in those states. Then there are more administrative issues. Many of you will have heard about gerrymandering, and this allows politicians to control constituency delimitation. And it's in fact legal for the majority party to redraw district boundaries to its political advantage. This is something that's very much discouraged in other parts of the world, where very often independent districting commissions are the ones that design constituency boundaries. And this is really considered to be the good practice worldwide, to have such independent districting commissions. You may know that voter registration in the United States is active rather than passive, like in many countries in the world. And what this means is that citizens have to really proactively request and fill out registration documentation so that they are included in voter lists, rather than being automatically included as a result, for instance, of population registration, like in Ukraine. And so as a result, there are only about 65% of the voting age population that are registered in the United States for the 2016 elections. And this varies very differently from other countries where that registration figure is nearly 90%. Unfortunately, there are also regular purges of the voter rolls. So for instance, before the 2016 elections, 16 million names were removed due to perceived irregularities, sometimes arguing that that person is no longer in that constituency, or that that person may have died, or for other reasons. But unfortunately, many people were also wrongfully removed and then not able to vote on election day. And that's a problem that still hasn't been solved in the United States. Voting is on a Tuesday today. So there's also many people that have to take time off from their employers to be able to go and vote. And this is sometimes difficult for people or economically unsustainable. It originally historically derived from the Tuesday after market days on Monday, where many people would travel to an urban center to be at that market for the Monday and then stay on to vote on the Tuesday. But many argue that this is now obsolete. And for many people, this also leads to very long lines because of under-resourcing, with some people having to wait as long as 8 to 10 hours to have to vote. There are unfortunately significant limitations on prisoner voting. Even those who have spent their sentences and have been released from prison. And this is something that's been commented by international observers as being against international good practice. However, despite all of this, there are some very positive signals for this election. Turnout is expected to be the highest in more than 100 years. And many of you will have seen that 100 million voters have already voted early, in person or by post. And so for a country that regularly sees turnout figures in the mid-30s, this is bound to be a monumental election. Then there's the role of women. And one of the interesting things is that in this election, a record number of women are standing for the House of Representatives in 2020. And this exceeds even the historic number set in the 2018 midterm elections, mostly Democrats, but also Republicans. And following the primaries, there are now 298 women registered to contest the elections. 204 of them are Democrats, 94 of them are Republicans. But both parties have shattered their previous records in terms of the number of women that are standing. And then lastly, I would just like to mention that like Ukraine, the United States has been adapting its election administration to the COVID environment in the same way that Ukraine is doing for its local elections that took place last week. And so you'll see people in polling stations wearing protective equipment. You'll see voters who are coming in having their temperature tested and also wearing face masks and sometimes gloves. You'll see election commissions sanitizing all of the equipment and materials in polling stations regularly. And you'll also see that people are spaced out to be socially distant from one another so that they maintain that distance to prevent infection to the maximum degree possible. And this has really impacted election operations worldwide. It comes at a considerable cost and also with additional planning, but it's very much hoped that this will protect.
Але всі сподіваються, що ми зможемо таки захистити тих людей, виборців, які сьогодні прийдуть на виборчі ділянки голосувати. Також хотілося подякувати за дуже важку роботу не тільки тут в Сполучених Штатах, але по всьому світові, всіх виборчих комісій, таких як ЦВК в Україні і громадянське суспільство, яке роблять все від них належне для того, щоб зробити наше середовище прозорим і безпечним. Тим, щоб дійсно ці рекордні вибори пройшли належним чином. Я сподіваюся, що при презентації інших панелістів
Thank you so much, Beata. And just a technical issue, I think if our interpreters can check to make sure that they're on the correct channel. That was incredibly enlightening, Beata. Thank you so much for sharing some of the really important aspects of how elections work in the United States and some of the parallels about what Ukraine is also dealing with at the same time with local elections happening still now around us. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker on the next session, which is Mindy Walker, who has a long history of democracy support around the world, as well as working on campaigns in the United States. Mindy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Nice to see you all. Happy election day. Good morning from here. Good evening there. I really appreciate talking to all you guys, and feel free to ask questions. Should I just head on into it, Meredith? Or do you want?
Oh,
yeah,
I'm
you have
happy to
questions
ask you questions, or you can talk about any topic you think is relevant. But maybe we start out with where you're calling in from and why Wisconsin is a particularly interesting state to look at in this election.
Good. Yeah. So I'm here in Wisconsin, which is in the middle of the United States. I've been running a campaign here for local office, so one of the state government seats for a woman who's 40 years old. So it's really exciting. But we're in a heavily gerrymandered district, which is what Beata just talked about. So it's a uphill climb when your borders are drawn specifically for a specific candidate to win. Wisconsin is what we call a purple state. So it means it's pretty well divided between blue, which is Democrats, and red, which is Republicans. It has some major cities, but it's a really rural area with only 5 million people living here. But the presidential candidates really fight over our states, even though we have 10 electoral votes. Again, something Beata talked about. Trump won here with less than 1% of the vote, or 20,000 votes. So it's a really big deal to win Wisconsin. Democrats think that they have it locked up this year, but we'll see. They thought that last time as well. And everyone has anxiety over who's going to win Wisconsin, in addition to, of course, the nation. Wisconsinites are coming out in record numbers, and it's really amazing to see this many people voting.
That's great. I think I'm always impressed, even as an American, about how diverse and huge the United States is and what different experiences people are having with the voting process around the country. You mentioned that you're running a local campaign. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to campaign in the US during COVID-19?
Yeah, we sort of have to rewrite all the rules, right? And I'm sure you guys experienced the same in Ukraine with your local elections. COVID has unfortunately, ravaged most of America, including rural and urban areas. In fact, Wisconsin is the third worst in the United States, with insofar as how many people per 100,000 are infected. So it's really hampered our ability to get our message out to voters. Normally you would have, especially in the Democratic Party, which is my party, people going out, knocking on doors, talking to as many voters as many times as possible. But this year is different. The Democratic Party decided not to do door knocking and focus mainly on phone calls. So we've been calling. My candidate, however, we're in a pretty rural area. And so we decided that we still have to get out and ask people for their votes. So we were all masked up and very socially distanced. We would hang a pamphlet on the door, ring the bell, walk way back, and try to have a very distant conversation with voters. And I think people appreciated that. But mostly phones, and mail, TV ads for those that can afford them, radio ads. So it's a lot less face-to-face, which is really how you earn people's votes. So it's been a big challenge about finding new creative ways to raise money, new creative ways to get people together on Zoom. And so I think the best part about this whole craziness has been finding creative ways to campaign, creative ways to reach people.
Yeah, it's been really amazing how adaptable and innovative people have been in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how they're doing trainings and education and also campaigning like you are. You mentioned that people in Wisconsin are voting in record numbers. Can you talk about why this election, in terms of these voters, might be a little bit different than what you've seen in the past?
Yeah, a lot of people have voted early here. Over 60% of Wisconsinites have voted absentee or early, which is something we've never seen before. Some of that is because they're afraid to go out for COVID. Some of it is just they're just so amped up about getting this election over with and making sure that their vote counts. Every state in America has different rules about early and absentee voting, but we've been working on early voting since October 20th and absentee voting even before that. So we've been, right, the first phase of a campaign is to persuade people to vote for your candidate. The second phase, really this year, was about trying to get our supporters to vote early, which is a new part of how we campaign. And so we were really focused on those early voters, and we've seen great results. And I just checked in with my team who is at a polling location telling us about the turnout. And it looks like more people voted than we had even registered in 2016. So just monster numbers. That doesn't necessarily mean Democrats will win, but we're hoping that big turnout numbers is good for democracy either way. So we see long lines at the polling stations today, people excited to get out and have their voice heard. So that's great.
Thanks so much, Mindy. I also get excited when you see massive turnout. It is a good thing for democracy, exactly like you said. So now we'll turn over to some of our Ukrainian experts to talk about what their thoughts are on what Mindy just shared, as well as the Ukrainian experience. So I'll hand over to my co-moderator, Elisa.
Дуже дякую, Мередіт.
Thanks a lot, Meredith. Right now, we had a chance to hear about some of the peculiar features of this year's presidential election in the US. And now it would be interesting to learn about Ukraine. What are similar peculiar features? What technologies are being used? Could the experience of the US election campaign could be compared to the Ukrainian one? What could be adapted here in Ukraine, how to make it more transparent and fair in Ukraine. And I would like to ask this question to Yevhen Magda, Director of the World Policy Institute, PhD in Political Science. Mr. Yevgeny, the floor is yours. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for having me and allowing me the opportunity to talk at this very interesting webinar. And it's true that the issues that you raised, initially I was at a loss because the level of the development of democracy in the US and in Ukraine are quite different still. I still vividly remember the presidential campaign of 2010 when the candidates to presidency of Ukraine tried to use the work of the Barack Obama's team, namely his approaches to involve internet and how at that time it looked for Ukrainian experience quite weird and new. And obviously, there was some technological gap at that time. But let's get back to the general issue, something that we need to discuss here. And the most important thing that we have to adopt and something that we can study some more is the respect to the choice of the voters and the respect to the uh, various possibilities and alternatives for voting. And despite the differences between the states, I still believe that within the next 24 hours, we will learn the name of the winner of this president election. And with the high level of probability, the one who loses will pass the presidency to the one who wins. What's interesting is that both presidential candidates by Ukrainian standards are elderly people, but still in the US, because of the COVID-19 situation and because this is a big country with huge territory, it still did not prevent both Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden to get involved on quite an impressive barnstorming campaign. There's another factor that I would like to draw attention to. Back in 2016, the US presidential elections face the problem of the Russian intrusion. And this created the domino effect uh, worldwide, where all the other countries recognize that if such a highly democratic country as the US could be the victim of such intrusion, well, something needs to be done. For Ukraine, that was also the lesson to be learned, because often enough our electoral democracy suffers often enough uh, from some secondary aspects, so to speak. Well, we can also learn from an interesting factor of the level of responsibility of the incumbent president, because before the beginning of the pandemic, the electoral breakdown was quite different, and how attentively the voters look at the real economic successes, how the economy does impact the political choice of the voters. I can not be silent about the debates, even though Mr. Trump was tested positive with COVID-19, even though the first round of debates proved to be, well, let me put it as controversial. Still, both candidates faced each other in the second, even though it was virtual round of debates, and proved that it's very important. So refusing to attend debates, ignoring the debates, is something for the American political culture is not acceptable. And I believe that in this respect, we have to reconsider some of the current aspects of our political life and culture. There's another moment I would like to draw your attention to is the Ukrainian context. Unfortunately, Ukraine, including during the debates, sounded not as powerfully and not with the tone of voice that we would like it to be, but the fact is the fact. And here we have to learn how the election should raise the level of subjectivity. We need to become more powerful. We need to learn how to attract attention to ourselves, not to be the object of somebody's attention. Obviously, the uh, volunteers' involvement during the election campaign, the ability of both political parties to use the powerful um, um, campaign machine requires not only funds and finances, but also the needed grassroots political support, which once again shows that there is room for improvement for us in terms of the political structuring of the Ukrainian civil society. There's another moment I would like to draw the attention at the very end of my speech. That's the positioning of the national media outlets. Just imagining that national media would tend aside from the major political fight of the political life of the US and for years is just impossible.
However, uh, such positioning does not prevent from media from following principles of freedom of speech. Thank you very much, Mr. Yevhen, for your detailed response and your insight. Now, I would like to pay attention of our dear audience to the local elections in Ukraine. What main challenges can we underline in relation to the local elections, and as well as do you have any suggestions as to the way to improve for the future? In this regard, I would like to give floor to Ms. Alexandra Chilovska, electoral law expert, Lviv National Ivan Franko University, postgraduate student. Hello. We shall be talking about local elections in Ukraine 2020. In my opinion, the local elections in Ukraine were conducted under conditions of uncertainty. First of all, we have had the change of electoral legislation. A new election code came into force, but not only the election code came into force in less than a year prior to the local elections. But in addition to it, amendments were made to the election code in 1 month prior to the day of voting, and prior to the commencement of the election process, which influenced negatively the election process, as the electoral stakeholders did not have sufficient time to prepare themselves for the local elections, as well as there was a great deal of uncertainty among the candidates. For some of them, it was a difficult question to answer whether they are going to run for elections or not. In addition to it, we have a new administrative organization of our country, and the newly created local councils in newly created amalgamated communities would have greater powers compared to those of the local councils elected 5 years ago, which meant that the role of candidates was extended in the latest elections. As a negative trend, we have that prior to each of the elections, we have the change and amendments to electoral legislation, and in this way we cannot ensure sustainable electoral operations, use of electoral systems, and we are still unsure what electoral system suits us the most, and this does not comply with the international best practices in administering elections. Basically, the change or adoption of the election code resulted in a change of the formula to be used in the local elections. So we have such communities with less than 10,000 voters and communities with more than 10,000 voters. And in addition to it, we have introduced the proportional electoral system with open lists and single mandate electoral system, which has been quite customary thing for Ukraine. However, that was slightly modified as well. Why I present it as a challenge for the electoral stakeholders? Because the electoral stakeholders or potential electoral stakeholders were not ready for such a change. We have territorial election commissions and district election commissions, and we have election commission members which were poorly trained or not trained at all, and especially taking into account such a change of electoral system and the quite complicated electoral system used in the local election, which resulted in a number of consequences, which I will mention later on. In addition to it, one of the innovations in the latest local elections in communities with the number of voters over 10,000 voters, we have seen the process of partization, because in such population centers, proportional electoral system was used, and political parties had to nominate candidates, taking into account that the latest elections were the local elections, and it was quite difficult to find candidates. Such change of the legal provisions and the borderline of 10,000 voters was something for which our political parties were not ready. In addition to it, the election code provided for compliance with the gender quota. Why I mention this point? Because in Ukraine we have had gender quotas applied during the previous electoral cycles. However, this time it was the first time ever when the failure to comply with the gender quota requirement served as the reason to cancel the registration of political party candidates. In the past, we have had the gender quota requirement. However, there were no major sanctions for failure to comply with it. That is why, as a result of it, political parties were seriously trying to comply with the gender quota requirement. In addition to it, in my mind, that the time period of 50 days for the local election campaign was too short to ensure quality campaigning. In addition to it, we have to remember that elections from the point of view of a voter, that is announcement of the beginning of the election process, registration of candidates, campaigning and voting, whereas for election administrators, that is a bit more difficult, and therefore they would appreciate having a longer time to prepare for the elections. I would suggest to expand the time period for the election campaign. I have already mentioned that this system of election commissions, and I have mentioned that the members of territorial and precinct election commissions were poorly trained. Actually, due to efforts of International Foundation for Electoral Systems and CC, a lot of trainings were organized and held for commissioners. However, that remains an important task in ensuring the quality of training. Perhaps certification of election commission members would be a good solution. What I am saying is that it is a rather difficult question which requires thorough consideration for decision making because it is related to serious consequences. Another specificity of the local election campaign, which resulted in low turnout. However, in my opinion, I, as a researcher of electoral systems in Eastern European countries, could say that a low turnout is not critical, and that is not a major drawback, especially in the local elections, because there is a trend that overall the turnout is likely to go down. In addition to it, the turnout in local elections at a level of 35% is quite a normal thing. That is why I would not consider it to be a major negative feature of the latest local elections. To sum up, I would like to say that the main challenges of what we have seen during the latest local elections were related to the change of electoral legislation, and the election process has been organized according to the new rules. The Central Election Commission had to produce a number of regulations and resolutions. I have to compliment the Central Election Commission for good work. But also uncertainty and lack of understanding of new provisions and lack of clarity of the new legislation resulted in the fact that the electoral environment was quite a difficult one for political parties and other electoral stakeholders, which had to solve many challenges. How to prevent from similar problem issues coming back in the future elections. I hope possibly the amendments to the election code would solve that problem. We have seen a lot of discrepancies and poor coordination between different provisions of the electoral legislation in the time period prior to the next elections. There shall be efforts to amend the electoral legislation, or by another way of tackling it is imposing sanctions and bringing those guilty of breach of law to liability. We usually we have had a lot of election disputes and complaints. However, rarely they are brought to an end. And I hope by the next elections we can have a simplified language of our electoral procedures, such as the procedure of vote counting and the tabulation of results of voting, to make sure that election commission members and voters understand fairly well what is going to happen with his or her vote and how to vote, actually. That is briefly about it, about challenges. I did not mention about the pandemic, but I think we can talk about it later on. How the situation with the quarantine in Ukraine has impacted the elections, especially the turnout, which I have already mentioned. Thank you very much, Ms. Alexandra, for your insight and for your recommendations for describing the main factors that impacted this year's local elections in Ukraine. As regards the pandemic, the next question which we would like to discuss with you is the crisis which affected the elections and how it has actually affected the elections and the day of voting. And is this crisis going to be able to influence the subsequent elections? And any lessons for Ukraine as taken into account US presidential elections? I would like to address all those questions to Mr. Volodymyr Fisenko, Director of Penta Center for Political Studies, political analyst. Mr. Volodymyr, floor is yours. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Hello. Thank you very much for having invited me to participate in this panel. It makes a lot of sense to actually compare and draw parallels between the election process in the US and in Ukraine, although we have different types of elections, presidential and local elections.
And our political systems are quite different, but still, such analysis will be timely and relevant. If we discuss the impact that the COVID-19 epidemics caused, well, first of all, uh, that became the major factor which in 2020 impacts the overall global situation as well as situations in particular countries. The pandemic changed everybody's lives, and obviously it's affected the electoral cycle as well, sometimes indirectly. Well, let's start by stating that being a medical and social problem, the pandemic revealed the need to fight it through lockdown, and this caused critical economic problems, especially in certain industries, which caused global economic crisis, affecting the economies both in Ukraine and in the US. But the deterioration of the economic life in any country, in most of the cases, negatively impacts ratings of the incumbent officials, especially when such a monumental election happens in such a pandemic year. So, as to the impact on the US elections, we heard that the pandemic did affect the incumbent president's
В Україні безумовно, от ця ситуація кризова, і економічна, і пандемічна ситуація стала однією з причин зниження результату президентської партії «Слуга народу» на місцевих виборах. І це не єдина причина, але сама епідемія стала викликом і для суспільства, і для влади. І виявилося, що влада не завжди
And it has turned out that the pandemic has brought a series of challenges, and our government had appeared to be unable to tackle all of them. The pandemic and later on the quarantine restrictions affect greatly the moods in the society. Although that has been indirect connection between the pandemic and the political life. However, there is a fear and fear as regards the actions of the government, which resulted in people getting tired and upset about everything that is going on. In certain countries, there were some massive protests against the COVID restrictions, and the nature of response as demonstrated by governments of the countries of the world was quite diverse. Suppressing the protests and trying to find other solutions. In Ukraine, we have seen the confrontation between the central and local governments. Some of the city mayors dared to criticize and to openly oppose the president and the central government. Whereas while the central government would insist on quarantine restrictions, the local authorities would rather favor the policy of limited restrictions. President of Ukraine has described this situation as a play or interaction of good policemen and bad policemen. The central government president actually wanted the central government to be a good policeman in this case, which benefited the local authorities and mayors in particular. We have been also witnessing the number of cases of violence which can be related as one of the consequences, described as one of the consequences of the pandemic. We have heard that the local elections that just are still finishing in Ukraine were going to be the very dirty elections full of manipulations. However, emotionally, it was a difficult process and it was difficult to predict actually how it is going to influence the outcome of the elections. In Ukraine, the pandemic impacted the elections in a way that it resulted in the one of the lowest turnouts over the latest electoral cycles. The turnout at the latest local elections of 37%, comparing to the turnout in the previous local elections in 2015, the turnout in 2015 was 47%, which means that the pandemic took away 10% of our voter turnout. We do not have the data yet disaggregated across the regions as to the voter turnout.
The possibility of post-in voting and the absentee voting, and it was mentioned already that the record early voting in the US this year was something that amazed everyone. And these alternatives proved to be quite handy in terms of ensuring proper safety of the voters. But in Ukraine, people treat such early voting critically because they're very much afraid of potential fraud involved. Obviously, our society soon will face the need to discuss the uh, e-voting. Everybody owns various gadgets and the software is available, but still in this country, people are afraid that there might be an external intrusion into e-voting, but that's the topic of separate discussion. In the US, I believe the pandemic negatively impacted even the primaries and partially distorted the stage of voting. In uh, Ukraine, such an impact was of a smaller um, caliber. We did tinker with the idea of postponing local elections, but hopefully we decided to stick to the original date. Otherwise, there would be some legal and political problems. Also, there were fears that some of the polling stations won't be open, but hopefully it never happened. But most importantly, the organizational aspects have not been affected. Whether the pandemic impacted the uh, mm, election campaign debates. Well, in the US, yes, we heard that, but at least in the US, they discussed how would be the most efficient ways to combat the pandemic and to learn from the mistakes made. But in Ukraine, unfortunately, the impact of COVID-19 on the election campaign was minimal. And it never became the critical topic for discussion. And my final conclusion as to how the pandemic impacted the uh, elections. Well, it did impact the pre-election campaign and the results of the local elections. We still don't know what would be the results of the US presidential elections, but we'll learn soon. But still, I believe that the most important aspects that did impact the results were purely political rather than pandemic. Uh, Also, I believe that the upcoming years would not be focused exclusively on how the pandemic would impact next election cycles, but mostly we will all depend on the results of the current US presidential elections.
Можливо, за виключенням системи
The US
президентських виборів. Вона
was
у вас трохи
always the
архаїчна.
example of
Але
democracy to
зараз ми
follow for
бачимо
us,
на
except probably for
відмірну
the
і
presidential
дуже
elections,
конфліктну
which
поляризацію
are
в американському
slightly
суспільстві.
archaic.
І це
But
може
now we
негативно
see the
вплинути на
division
державний
in
правовий
the
рід,
American
зокрема
society,
через
which
невизнання
might
результатів
cause
виборів
the
тією
risk
стороною,
of
яка
not
отримує
acknowledging the
перевагу.
results
Ми
of
всі
the
з таким негативним досвідом вже
vote
стикалися.
counts by the
А от
losing
США
side. We have
висувають
faced this
такі
problem already in
пропозиції, і це
Ukraine, but US
потенціально для
might face
американських
it for the
виборів.
first
І ми
time,
бажаємо
and
американським
that will
друзям
be the
гідно і
challenge.
демократично
And we wish
відповісти на
our
цей
American
виклик.
friends
І
to
ми хочемо
withstand this
вчитися на
challenge,
позитивах американської
and
демократії. Тому,
we
будь
want
ласка,
to continue
прочитайте
to learn
якихось
from the
позитивних.
positive aspects of the American democracy. So please avoid any uh,
Дуже влучний коментар.
abnormalities. Thank you, uh, Mr. Volodymyr. Quite an interesting take on comparing how it happened in US and in Ukraine. And now we move to the second block of questions that deal with the state of play with exercising a right to vote for persons with disabilities. And I would like to give the floor to our moderator, Meredith. Meredith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisa. So
Uh,
next up, we will show an interview with Michelle Bishop, who is the Voter Access and Engagement Manager at the National Disability Rights Network in the United States. And in the US, the rights of people with disabilities, including electoral rights, are legally protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which she refers to as the ADA. This legislation means that all polling places and methods of voting should be accessible for all people, including people with disabilities. So let's take a look at the video. Anton, I think that we are not getting any sound on the video. Can you please restart the video with sound? Apologies for that. It wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't have something happen with technology. But while we sort out the video, we can watch that after our next panelists, who are really exciting advocates of people with disabilities and all people in Ukraine. So Elisa, I'll turn it over to you while we figure out what's happening with the video.
Так, дякую, Мередіт. Зараз ми б
Thank
хотіли
you, Meredith.
про стан
Now we would like to learn about the state of play on implementing the electoral rights for persons with disabilities. What are the expectations from the government, and what's the state of play at the level of the government? It would be also interesting to learn how important is the role of the public organizations and civil rights organizations in the advocacy campaigns that fight for the exercising of the right to vote for persons with disabilities. And the floor goes to Irina Tikuchova, Inclusion and Equality Analyst at the Organization of People with Disabilities Fight for Right. Irina, the floor is yours. Good evening, and thank you for having me here and being part of this interesting discussion. The video was about the alternative forms of voting, and I would like to start with this.
The importance and the possibility to choose the most convenient method of voting for yourself is a very important concept for ensuring the conditions for the exercise of electoral rights, regardless of whether a person has has got a disability or has got no disability. In Ukraine, we have the definition of citizens that are unable to move independently on a permanent basis. And if a person has no possibility to move independently, such a person is considered as such that would require only one method of voting as homebound voting, and there is no choice. It does not give any choice to such voters, and such voters will have to stick to the only method of voting available to them, and that video was about it. And I would like to comment on this video, and we should differentiate between the legal point of view and the practice. Back in 2016, the Association of People with Disabilities conducted a research and concluded if a voter is offered to vote using exclusively one method of voting, that would be the violation of Article 29 and 4 of UN Convention on Disabilities, and in accordance with Article 4 of the UN Convention, the states which have ratified it have committed to do everything possible to engage all citizens, including citizens with disabilities, into social and political processes. When we see videos or information on the internet, photographs photographs in which a voter on a wheelchair is being lifted by three assistants going 3 floors up to the voting premises, we could not be talking about inclusive and accessible election process. Therefore, the role of the state and the role of the government should be to ensure all conditions are in place, to ensure all conditions for inclusivity and accessibility of the voting. We have participated in the work of the working group created at the Central Election Commission to facilitate the creation of conditions at all polling places across Ukraine to assist voters with disabilities. Mr. Serhiy Postivy will be able to tell you more about it later on. If we talk about accessible election process, it should be accessible to all, not only voters with disabilities. When we talk about challenges we come across in the election process, I would like to talk about several types of such challenges. Typical challenges which we are likely to encounter at any time during the electoral cycle, and the new challenges. Throughout the decades or many years, we have had the prohibition to vote for persons recognized as legally incompetent. Prior to 2015, when the action plan was developed to to implement this strategy to ensure human rights. One aspect of it was to stress the importance for the government to study the best practices of administering or organizing voting for persons recognized as legally incompetent by the court. And the idea was to develop a series of recommendations for the government, for the central government. The project implementer at that time was the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine, which recommended not to introduce any changes to the legislation and that project finished by 2017. And it resulted in the fact that for several years, the question of disabilities was out of focus of the government. And the projects and the things we are working on, such as ensuring possibilities for greater possibilities for inclusion of people with disabilities, guardianship, and other things, allow me to state that we are developing our projects in a prompt fashion, and that gives me the reason to believe in the near future we would accomplish success in our advocacy campaign to lift that prohibition. I know that the situation in the US is better. Such ban has been lifted a long time ago. In the European countries, situation is improving. Many countries have lifted such a ban, and other countries are still working towards that goal. And we still have it on our agenda within the framework of human rights activist agenda, that we should consider the right to vote as inalienable right of all voters. Another problem that is quite difficult for us to solve is assisting voters in voting. I spoke earlier about it. If the government provides for assistance of all for all during the voting process, that would be the violation of Article 29 of the UN Convention. And what response or what action plan would the civil society come up with? Machine voting, I do not talk about electronic voting, but machine voting to assist people with different forms of disabilities, machine voting that would assist them in voting, keeping with the principles of secrecy of voting and independence. I think during the next election cycle, we will be able to test, to pilot machine voting for people with disabilities at the selected polling station to decide later on whether we can implement such machine voting in our Ukrainian reality. Another challenge which we another challenge which was encountered by many voters with visual disabilities, and I know that some people are drawing up a lawsuit to be filed against the CC, or complaint to be filed against the CC, is the inability for people with visual disabilities to vote, and we should advocate for having a ballot paper as accessible for people with visual disabilities. And people that need assistance, their needs shall be addressed by having a proper design of the ballot paper. People with psychosocial or intellectual disabilities, that is another challenge when we talk about the practice and when we try to implement the practice of designing information materials in an accessible format, accessible for all, that would be a very good thing. Another challenge which we have come across with during the recent local election campaign, that was the setup of the voting booth and places for voting for people with COVID symptoms and people with disabilities. And we have come across several cases when voting booths for people with disabilities were used for voting by voters with COVID. That is unacceptable. We hope the situation with COVID will be improved by the next elections. However, information campaigns and awareness raising campaigns shall be conducted on a regular basis to tackle such issues, and that is along the lines of our advocacy campaign plan and our approach in advocating for the rights of people with disabilities, not only in the political life. That is briefly about it. I would be happy to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you very much, Miss Irina, for your insight and for your review of the situation in Ukraine, as well as comparing it with the situation in the US, where civil society groups do everything possible to make sure rights of people with disabilities are protected. As regards video, we don't have time to play it now, but we will send you the link to it so that you can watch it later on. Tonight we have with us the member of the Central Election Commission, responsible for a number of issues, including protecting the voting rights of people with disabilities. Mr. Serhiy Postivey, what do you do to better protect the rights of people with disabilities? Do you borrow experience of other countries? Good evening. Great pleasure to participate in your webinar. Thank you for having invited me to speak, to share with you our experience of the Central Election Commission, and to share with you the information and the things we have developed there in the Central Election Commission. As regards the providing for the rights of voters with disabilities and people with disabilities. Unfortunately, I have to say, in Ukraine, we should pay more attention to such issues at all levels, not only at the level of communities, but also at the level of central executive government to mainstream issues of inclusion. Election code. Ms. Irina has already mentioned that we have created a working group at the Central Election Commission to deal with issues of voters with disabilities. One of the tasks for this working group is to develop a series of regulations for the CC to adopt, we include about 20 non-governmental organizations, human rights activists dealing with human rights of people with disabilities.
IFES is also represented in our working group with its experts, and together we designed some uh, um, findings, especially in terms of legislative drafts, which would improve the norms of the electoral code to better exercise the right to vote for persons with disabilities. And our findings were used by the Central Electoral Commission for their draft filed with the parliament. And now we have the electoral code that represents the whole um, set of new norms that regulate information support, legal rights of people with disabilities to reduce the barriers of access during the elections. That was one of the first steps, but that was probably one of the key ones as well, because it's the regulatory and legislative changes that would ensure further practical implementation of all our findings. After the relevant changes to electoral codes have been introduced, we've finally had the norms that stipulate, most of all, the ability to appeal by the voters the instances of inability to access the polling stations and voting places. Before that, there was no chance to appeal, even though um, um, the polling stations were not accessible. Now we can make the court rule in our favor. Also, it stipulates that by 2025, the local self-government bodies and local executive bodies should make sure that all the polling stations will be accessible and all relevant infrastructural changes will be introduced. As to the informational support, the new provisions cover mostly the involvement of the Central Electoral Commission, because now it's the CEC bylaws, the regulations that could become instrumental. And our working group has suggested lots of suggestions to such regulations which properly regulate the information support procedures, namely what type of information should be made accessible. The websites of the CC, the state electors registry, have been streamlined to make sure that they are accessible for the people with disabilities, especially disabilities with sight. And now they can learn more about the election campaigns, candidates, the procedure for voting. Also, we started implementing the elements of application. Namely, we printed publications that explain the rights and responsibilities involved in uh, election cycle. They were both printed on paper and they had the QR code, which would allow the voters to look at it, translate it into sign language. Also, it was provided in the form of videos with the text subtitles. So even on the polling station, the voters had the ability to learn some electoral information. It's still worth stating that the ballot is quite complicated. It is complicated not only to persons with disabilities, it is complicated to understand for most of the voters. And the major problem being that the font was too small and it was tough to read these ballots to elderly people or people with disabilities. So this is a problem for sure. Uh, uh, and thus, uh, unfortunately, we, as the Commission, had to follow the norm from the electoral code, but now we are initiating the discussion to ensure that the next elections will enjoy the ballots that would be accessible to everyone without any exception. I fully support the idea expressed by Ms. Irina, and the CC is working on this already, by the way, that in addition to the working group on the protection of the right to vote for persons with disabilities, we have yet another working group working on the implementation of innovative technologies into the voting process. And we are studying the international experience, in particular that of US, using the voting machines used in the US in particular. Also, we are studying the international experience in the context of exercising right to vote for persons with disabilities, and lots of novelties we introduce in our legislation is the result of the analysis of the international best practices that we have carried out. And I'm now more of an optimist. And Ms. Irina said that hopefully by the next local elections, we'll have some pilots, polling stations in place. I hope that by next uh, local elections, we will introduce voting machines at every polling station, or at least some other technical means and hardware that would allow, without anybody else outside help, user-friendly votes to any voter, and without the need to ask for favors from the poll workers or other persons, so that such hardware and software would allow a person to independently and with dignity exercise the right to vote. The voting machines, some software tools, they untie the hands in this context. They provide more opportunities for full exercising of voting rights. And that's what we're working on. Also, grasping this opportunity, I would like to thank IFES and Fight for Rights NGO. We even had a joint project with them. Uh, they're modest and never mention this, but we are piloting already lots of various projects, technical solutions, which based on the results of this voting cycle would be analyzed, all their pros and cons. And for the upcoming elections, we would be in the position to recommend the solutions that would uh, simplify life for voters. We have two ways to choose: infrastructural accessibility, which is more difficult to achieve because it's aimed mostly at uh, uh, through the funding of local governments, and informational accessibility. Here, there is a broad room for maneuver for CC, and our commission is doing its best to first learn international best practices in this regard, and we will be grateful to any criticism, especially constructive criticism, that we would definitely hear and take action upon. And I am keeping a close eye on the US presidential elections, both from the standpoint of accessibility and lockdown and quarantine measures, which I believe will not be lifted in the foreseeable near future. And in Ukraine, we'll have elections twice a year, so in the upcoming years. The first elections when the territorial communities will be formed for the first time ever, and this experience would be invaluable to us. Thank you, and I'm open for
За ваш такий
questions. Thank you,
обширений
Sergey,
коментар.
for your expanded commentary and for all the actions of the CEC
Та
to
за те, що ви особисто
ensure the
опікуєтесь.
exercising of the voting rights for persons with disabilities. And thank you for taking it very seriously. Hopefully,
Спільних
in the
зусиль,
upcoming
включно
couple of years, through joint efforts with the involvement of NGOs, international partners, will help
краще,
to
ніж вона є
substantially
зараз.
change the situation for the better. And now we move to the third block of questions. Use of social media at the election campaigns, observation of the elections. Back to you, Meredith.
Thank you, Elisa. So we're also welcoming in another American now who's calling in from a different state in the United States. So welcome to Sarah O. Sarah O is also someone who has worked on democracy promotion around the world and is currently an election observer in Arizona. She also has worked both with social media companies and social media activists and looked really closely at how social media impacts democracy. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Meredith. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you great.
Great. It's so great to join this dialogue. I think it's so important that civic leaders, both in the US and Ukraine and elsewhere, are talking about lessons and best practices. So great to see this happening.
Well, thank you for taking time out of what I imagine is a very busy day at the polls, looking at the process. So just to start off with, where are you calling in from today and why is it an interesting place in the US?
Yeah, I'm in Arizona. I've been here the last week on the ground. I'm not from Arizona. I'm actually Californian. But Arizona is what we call a swing state. And it's interesting because Arizona consistently votes Republican and has voted Republican for quite a long time. But over the last 30 years, the state has changed a lot. The population has grown. You have a much more diverse population. And, you know, if the Democrats win in Arizona, if Biden wins Arizona, this would only be the second time that that's happened in terms of a Democratic presidential candidate. So it would be a fairly significant outlier event if that happens. So if you talk to Democrats today and then in previous days, you might hear them talking about watching Arizona flip over the next few days and weeks.
Thanks, Sarah. So to pull a little bit away from what you're actually doing today, you've long worked with social media and been looking at how social media impacts elections. In the US, what role has social media been playing in the elections there so far, in your opinion?
Yeah, big question. It's been on everyone's minds, and I think something that we'll continue to talk about for a long time, even after the election. But it's been a powerful organizing tool on the one hand, right? So you have massive voter outreach campaigns happening exclusively on social media in the online space. It's been helpful for things like conveying updates around registration. As most people on this call probably know, each state has a totally different process, different dates and requirements. And voter turnout has been something else that a lot of organizations and both the campaigns have been looking to social media too, especially in driving the youth vote. So lots of wins, especially while we're all at home on our devices and in some cases on lockdown. It's been very important when you can't have these big campaign events like Mindy was saying earlier. On the other side, though, there's a lot of concern about foreign interference. Everyone remembers 2016 and a lot of other events that have happened since then. What's interesting, I think, is over the last few months, you've heard of a lot of concern about domestic groups abusing social media, whether they're extremist organizations who are promoting misleading information, inciting violence, or targeting vulnerable groups. There's been a lot of discussion in the media about elites, political elites spreading misinformation. And that stuff is not too different from what I've seen international researchers document in other countries, and unfortunately. No one wants things like photos of ballots in dumpsters going viral and circulating. Things like that obviously cast doubt and suspicion and could affect how people think about voting, and at worst could lead to things like offline violence or harm against people who are trying to vote. And so there's a lot of concern around that, and I think it's something that as civic organizations, as volunteers who care about safe voting and creating a safe media environment, we'll need to continue to look at beyond even today in this election.
Yeah, Sarah, you made a really good point about legitimacy and integrity and perceived integrity and how what we're
Mm.
seeing and hearing can impact that. And I think that feeds into what you're doing today. So you're a poll observer in Arizona. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like and what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've been telling everyone today that today's not just election day, we've been using the phrase today's the last day of voting. There's been such a big push around early voting. A lot of people have already voted in Arizona. On a few days ago, on the 30th, it hit well beyond the 2 million mark, which is historic for early voting. And so I think people are finding, some observers are finding in some parts of the state, the polls are actually more quiet than they expected. And they're hoping that it's because a lot of people have already voted. Arizona, I know there's some discussion earlier about laws in the US. In Arizona, the law protects voter rights, both in the polling place, what a safe environment looks like. And so observers are vigilant and looking out for anything that might interfere with that. So that's what everyone is doing, making sure no intimidation or harassment or really anything is getting in the way of the process. We will wait until every voter votes. The polls close at 7. And like I said, I mean, every polling location is different. You know, states are so vast. Arizona is a vast territory, but there are at least 3 counties people are watching very closely. I think the experience is slightly different there. But yeah, the job is usually boring in some states in the US, and I think everyone's just hoping today will be the same.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think we all hope for something that is calm and boring today, and that everyone votes peacefully, gets their vote out, but that there are no disruptions. So we will let you get back to your work, which is so important. And thank you so much for calling in. I will now hand it
Thanks,
back over
everyone.
to Elisa. Thanks, Sarah.
Мали змогу послухати, як соціальні мережі використовуються.
We had an opportunity to talk a bit about how the social media have been used in the United States and what impact social media created over the election process. And I would like to discuss with our experts in Ukraine how social media have been used in Ukraine, whether we have the problem of misinformation in Ukraine, and how serious that is. And please follow the time schedule. Yes, of course, I will observe the time schedule. I would like to say that the question of social media and their role in the election process in Ukraine has not been studied extensively, although the Ukrainian politicians have been using the social media a lot. Lately, we have seen that, especially during the presidential or parliamentary elections, participation of politicians in Facebook and Instagram. As regards local elections, we have had their slightly limited possibility to communicate with voters offline, and that is why politicians were rather using social media and online platform for campaigning. And we are seeing that more and more candidates from political parties use Facebook. We see a lot of new Facebook pages being registered individually for politicians or pages for political parties. And politicians all across the regions of Ukraine seem to have created their Facebook pages as well as their political parties pages. And we have also witnessed the increase of spending on advertising in social media. We get this information from official reports, and I think we are going to see the same in the financial reports of political parties and candidates. They have submitted interim financial reports, and we expect them to file their final financial reports shortly. Other methods and means of communication, such as outdoor advertising, advertising on TV, and in other media, indicates. I apologize for interference. They were not replaced by the new tools as regards the content of messages, the variety of messaging, candidates talking about themselves, about their families. I have analyzed in a random way pages of mayors candidates pages in several regions. My analysis would not be fully representative. However, as regards the information that they publish, 70% of information is about their political programs, their family, their activities, and 30% of posts are about their competitors or response to communication with their rivals. That is briefly about social media. Also, I would like to say that a good question is whether our politicians and political parties have their own strategy of running Facebook accounts. Clearly, during the parliamentary elections or national elections, it becomes visible. Political parties do have their strategies in running their Facebook pages. As regards personal Facebook pages of candidates nominated by political parties, we could see that a few of them have a strategy, a comprehensive strategy. Candidates in small population centers would rather organize their Facebook pages in a random way, announcing dates and venues of their meetings with voters, something like that. Candidates, depending on the size of the population center, they can pay more or less attention to the content of their posts on Facebook pages. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for your review of major trends in social media used in elections. Now we shall proceed with the final session in our panel discussion. It is dedicated to the specifics of the US electoral system, advantages and disadvantages. And we have with us Alexei Harang, Professor of Comparative Political Science, National University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, Research Director at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Mr. Harang, tell us please about the specificity of the US political system, and tell us about the electoral college in the electoral system in the United States, and also tell us about primaries and why this type of voting is becoming increasingly more popular globally. Mr. Alexei. Yes, good evening. Thank you for your invitation. You have raised a very broad question. I think people that are there with us tonight are very well educated and informed in the field of elections. However, what the question, what we can borrow or learn from the US experience, I would like to say our systems are actually very different. Presidential model in the United States, it exists in the United States, in South America, and then Philippines, and nothing like that exists in the European countries to have president leading the government. If we talk about majority electoral system in the elections in the US, we are moving towards majority plurality electoral system. We do not have bipartisan system, which is usually favored by a majority electoral system. I think the victory of the servant of the people and the mono majority is rather an exception from that rule. We have had many coalitions or coalition governments before, and I think this model is something more innate to us. Governors in the United States and elections, other types of elections in the US is something very different from Ukrainian experience. We are seeing a lot of voting by mail and early voting, while we're still discussing how to introduce voting by mail in Ukraine, or whether this method of voting would be perceived as fair. And the question of early election, I think, is not relevant in our experience, because the question comes immediately how you organize vote counting and what is going to happen with ballot papers. That is something we have seen during the referendum organized by President Kuchma in the year 2000. Against the backdrop of the recent years of the Ukrainian experience, as we have discussed, whether we have discussed it at this conference, at this webinar, or at CNN. I'm listening to CNN a lot lately, which comment a lot about populism in the American society as well as in the Ukrainian society. And we see a lot of things that are in common, applicable to both countries. And another problem, which can be described by the English expression history matters, when in Ukraine we discuss the problems that exist out there right now, we tend to explain these problem issues as a consequence of policy of Russification and Sovietization, Soviet era. Whereas in the United States, history matters applies to the fight for right of African Americans, and of course, we see a considerable progress of the United States in overcoming those problems. However, we see great difficulties in overcoming those problems. Although we have a number of problems in Ukraine linked to the fact of Ukraine being a part of a major empire. The experience of the United States and where it can be useful for us, it seems to me that is the question about allocation or distribution of powers, assigning powers, president, prime minister. They may belong to different political parties. However, what is important to mention in the United States, there are few chances for any political power to usurp or monopolize the power. President will have to coexist with the parliament.
And this is extremely important, where we see the combination of a very strong and powerful president who can, at the same time, coexist with the Congress, where his opponents or her might have a difference of opinion. So that's one of the intrigues of this election, not only who will win in the presidency, but also what would be the composition of in the parliament, whether one party will control uh, both chambers or something different. So for us, that's extremely important because our system also has to prevent the monopolization, the monopoly of power in the hands of one political party, and thus the American experience would be quite useful for us. Referendum might be quite interesting for us, especially in the context of the um, upcoming law on referendum, and the current government places high hopes on it. But also, referendum brings uh, threats to the stability of the political life of the country, not only for the developing economy, but also developed economies. Brexit, as an example. In the US, the referendum practices are well used at the local level, but at the federal level, there is no referendum practice, as far as I know, uh, and that's also important. So those supporters of referendum who hope to use actively this instrument in our political environment, well, think about uh, the US approach. Local referendums, yes, not at the federal level. With us, it's different. The law on the federal referendum would be introduced, but there is no law on how to conduct local referendums. That's the thing to consider. You asked me to discuss the electoral college here. I don't think that people need this information because we all learned recently that that's a historical system that still keeps existing. So uh, it's true. That's what makes the US presidential election so unique. Political analysts and commentators need to be well aware of its intricacies, but it has very little to do with our realities. While discussing primaries is very important because primaries were launched first in the US, and now this system of primaries has been widely spread in the European countries. The essence of primaries is that first you have the primary elections within the parties, and then the members of the party have the impact on the candidates uh, of their party. Now, the primaries are being used in France when electing the president, and in Germany when electing the future uh, political party leaders. But especially in the US, uh, the system that no other country has, the uh, primaries as the partisan elections are regulated by the legislation of each particular state. That's one uniqueness. And the second unique feature is that uh, not only party members can uh, participate in the primaries, which makes it very unique. And it's most likely not going to fly in the US format of it. But the primaries as an idea, well, this is something that, if I believe, has been discussed previously before. but there were no true primaries. So some discussions, some debates, but usually they are done behind the scenes. There is no true voting on the party level, and then the candidates to the mayor's seats or to the party um, tickets are decided by the leaders of the parties. So our parties are discussing about the needs of to introduce primaries, but it's still being used mostly as spin doctor technologies with no actual backup behind them. And in this respect, I believe we will have to think more about it to develop this instrument of interpartisan democracy, but it will be not possible until our political parties are still like um, pro- um, lobbying machines and not true democratic institutions. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Alexei, for such a great background into the US election system with comparisons with how it's happening in Ukraine. Was very curious for me to know, to learn all that, especially your take on the referendums uh, after the parliamentary voting. Hopefully, uh, we'll see some shape of it. Well, as for referendum, there are some conclusions on the draft law on this referendum, and lawyers are more or less positive about this draft. But even if it's true, in addition to legal mechanism, there is a political context, and the political context might go outside the wishes even of those who initiated it, because we should recognize that if we start discussing at the referendum the issues that divide the country, not even of a geopolitical nature, but say land reform, we can witness the blocking of any reforms in the country. And so opponents and destructive forces would easily be able to initiate the referendum to block all the reforms. Getting 3 million votes with the existence of current political machines, well, it's easy. And thus, I would want our legislators and their advisors to think and hard. Obviously, the servants of the people party will claim that we delivered on our uh, election um, promises, but Russia might make good use of it, and it might have a lasting impact on the future of the country. Thank you for your thoughts. And once again, after the law is passed, hopefully it would be of a high quality, reflecting on the best international standards. Now, I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Volodymyr Fesenka, asking Mr. Volodymyr the following question to you. What are the key challenges that US and Ukraine faced both before and during the elections of this year? Commonalities, differences, what impacts they had on the election process, and whether Ukraine should draw some conclusions and lessons from the US experience, and if yes, which? Thank you. Since we're running out of time, I will go in bullets. And I'll start with the key challenges that both of our countries face. And it's better to make conclusions from the joint challenges. They just have different shape and form in the US and Ukraine. So the key challenge, as I mentioned before, it's both for US and Ukraine, is an excessive polarization of the political life and the electoral process. Uh, what's the problem with it? The competing sides should start considering each other not only as competitors, but as enemies, as foes. And as a result, sometimes, and God forbid, not always, the electoral process might transform into political war, and that brings the challenge not only to the election but to the political life. For us, we faced that challenge for a long time. For US, this became a fresh challenge, and especially taxing for a developed democracy. It's the test for its durability, and it's important for Ukraine that the US elections will prove that democratic institutions do work, so that people will not have disillusionments in the American democracy, because the critics and the enemies of democracy, those who are proponents of Eurasian pro-Putin authoritarian regime, will use it in their favor. So, secondly, it's important for us also because US is our key strategic partner, and that's the country that helps us to suppress the attacks from the aggressor. So the undermining of democracy in US will be very damaging for us as well, and thus we need to look into ways to reduce this pressure, pent-up pressure in the uh, election process, to um, uh, support more centric approaches, so that the sides would not polarize into friends or foes, but rather would stick to gentleman's game rather than war, and mutual respect to the opponents, of course. Uh, we've seen the first debates between two candidates, and that's not a good example to follow, because we ourselves have huge problems with debates here, and we want the US to stay the positive example to follow for us. So room for improvement, of course, and we still have more to learn in terms of political culture from US, but still there are risks and problems, and we hope and we wish that they would be overcome. Another joint key challenge was COVID-19 pandemic, but looking forward, I believe we should think about the better tools to ensure safety, especially online voting. I believe e-voting would be the subject for discussion both in Ukraine and in the US, especially from the safety and security standpoint. Uh, which brings me to another challenge, which is more or less brand new both for US and Ukraine, even though we've seen it from day one of our existence: external intrusions, especially using social media. Uh, as you know, in US recently there were a number of scandals and investigations, and the uh, measures to prevent the repeats of such intrusions were substantial, and hopefully there will be no repeat of 2016. And cyber security becomes the requirement, the must for all of the countries. And here we can learn a lot from the US, and we already do, as far as I know. So cybersecurity should be an important component of any electoral management practices, especially if e-voting is introduced. The global management of social media uh, mm, is something to learn from each other. Ukraine has chosen another approach, blocking Russian social media, but still, Russia unfortunately impacts Ukrainian political process and elections through some of the TV channels and media outlets that still belong to pro-Russian owners. And here we needed to find the balance between the freedom of speech and at the same time neutralizing the external threats. And finally,
головна проблема, можливо, для нас
The main
це
problem for us,
використання української
most
теми на
likely,
виборах в США.
is the
Нам неважлива,
use of the
найважливіше,
Ukrainian topic
щоб
in the US
українська тема
elections.
далі в
What's
США не
important
фігурувала в
is that
системному забарвленні
Ukraine will no
державного
longer be
політичного
used
процесу.
in the
Треба
context of
очистити і
scandals in
раціоналізувати
the
тему стосунків України з США.
US political life. We just
Тільки
need
наші
to
інтереси.
uh,
Дякую.
work jointly on neutralizing that topic. Thank you, Mr. Volodymyr, for an interesting take on the list of challenges. It's true that the coordination between the countries is important and essential on many issues and topics. So today we have heard lots of interesting ideas.
To conclude our very interesting discussion, I would like to ask a broader question, and I would like to address it to Mr. Yevhen Makhda. Why this election, this presidential election in the United States is so important globally, and what does it mean globally, and what does it mean for Ukraine? Of course, I will be brief. I understand that we have been discussing things for about 2 hours. I think in the global, against the backdrop of the global things, this is a flagman election, which ought to show the entire world that the most powerful state of the world is able to hold elections in spite of the challenges of the pandemic, in spite of the attempts of China, Russia to discredit the political processes as such. And I think that the democratic nature of these flagship elections in the US would provide an incentive for the entire world. Second point, I would like to mention bipartisan support. I hope that we, Ukraine, as the state, as the country, will have to prove for the United States that Ukraine has been and remains an important partner in energy sector, defense sector, or developing democracy in Ukraine. We ought to be a transparent and predictable partner for the United States. And I hope it will work out for us. Thank you, Mr. Yevhen. On behalf of IFES, I would like to thank our experts, our speakers today. Thank you for your insights and sharing with us your observation of both election process in the United States and in Ukraine. Thank you for your review of the specifics of the US electoral system, as well as your attempts to compare US electoral system and the Ukrainian electoral system. We continue watching closely the process of voting in the United States. And now I would like to give floor to Meredith for her final remarks. Meredith, floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for this discussion. I know that I will be watching what happens in the United States very closely, but it has been very enlightening to learn from all of our panelists about how some of these lessons can be applied to Ukraine. I would also like to thank everyone who supported making this program possible, our sign language interpreters, our Ukrainian to English interpreters, all of our panelists, IFES, as well as those who prepared this panel discussion, especially Tanya Kupusovska and Ludmila, and everyone else who supported it. So thank you all for joining, and stay safe and healthy and well.